Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel, Old Boy here. I just want to say thanks to everyone who checked out my previous videos where we looked at the origin mythologies of the Britons, the Scots and the Irish. There were some really good discussions in the comments section. I had a really good back and forth discussion with a few of you there, so thank you very much. I also want to take this opportunity to say Croeso or Yorkshire to all my Welsh viewers. I know there's a few of you out there, I appreciate you being here, so thanks for watching. And today we're going to be looking at the Phoenicians in Britain. Now, disclaimer before we move ahead: I'm not an expert, I'm not an academic, but what I can bring to the table is I'll pull together information from various different backgrounds and present it and just follow the thread to see what we can find. So, in order to do that, this is going to be broken down into a few parts. I've tried numerous times to record this, it's just getting far too long, so I'm just going to split it up into maybe around 3 or 4 parts. So to begin with, we're going to be looking at what a few modern sources are saying. Then we're going to go back to the 1800s and we're going to have a look at what journals and books were saying in that period of time. We're going to have a look at some classical sources and a little bit of language as well. Then we're going to look at some geography and geology. Then we're going to look at some archaeological evidence. And finally, we're going to have a look at what academics are saying currently who are studying this field. So it's going to be, well, I hope it's going to be comprehensive. There's a lot to pack in, so I'm just going to get straight into it. And most importantly, I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so first we're going to just have a look at what historic Cornwall have got to say. So, quote, "The Phoenicians were a maritime people from the Levant who established an empire spanning the Mediterranean in the 1st millennium BCE. Phoenician colonies were spread throughout the Mediterranean, including what is now Spain, Italy, Malta, Sicily, North Africa, and on the coasts of the Levant. The Phoenicians also had outposts in the Atlantic, such as the one at Cadiz in southern Spain. Phoenician traders and colonists also settled in other areas, such as Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Aegean Islands. It has long been speculated that the Phoenicians also settled in Britain, and there is some evidence to support this. Phoenician pottery and other artefacts have been found in Wales, and the place names of some Welsh towns and villages appear to be of Phoenician origin. The Phoenicians were skilled sailors and master shipbuilders, and they may have used Wales as a base for exploring and trading with the British Isles. Whether or not the Phoenicians actually settled in Wales, they certainly had a significant impact on the country. The Phoenician presence in Britain helped to facilitate the spread of the Celtic culture, language and religion. The Phoenicians were also responsible for introducing new technologies and ideas such as the alphabet to the British Isles." End quote. Okay, so I've had a look and unfortunately I can't actually find any articles relating to this Phoenician pottery that was found in Wales. So if anybody out there knows a link or has any more information on that, please stick it in the comments section because I would love to take a look at it. Moving on, next we are going to have a look at what World History Encyclopedia have to say. They've provided a very nice map here of the Phoenician expansion from the 11th to 6th centuries BCE. So I'll put that up on screen so you can follow along with that as well. Quote, "The Phoenicians, based on a narrow coastal strip of the Levant, put their excellent seafaring skills to good use and created a network of colonies and trade centres across the ancient Mediterranean. Their major trade routes were by sea to the Greek islands, across southern Europe, down the Atlantic coast of Africa and up to ancient Britain. In addition, Arabia and India were reached via the Red Sea, and vast areas of Western Asia were connected to the homeland via land routes where goods were transported by caravan." Okay, so it's nice that they've included that as well. I think people with a casual interest or articles that are just casually written, they don't often mention the land routes, so it's nice that they've included that there as well. By the 9th century BCE, the Phoenicians had established themselves as one of the greatest trading powers in the ancient world. Trade and the search for valuable commodities necessitated the establishment of permanent trading posts, and as the Phoenician ships generally sailed close to the coast and only in daytime, regular way stations too. These outposts became more firmly established in order to control the trade in specific commodities available at that specific site. In time, these developed further to become full colonies, so that a permanent Phoenician influence eventually extended around the whole coastline of the ancient Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Okay, so a lot of these way stations, it says here, eventually became full-time colonies. So that's interesting, that's something to note, and just keep in the back of your mind for later. Their broad-bottomed, single-sail cargo ships transported goods from Lebanon to the Atlantic coast of Africa, Britain and even the Canary Islands, and brought goods back in the opposite direction, stopping at trade centres anywhere else between. Nor was trade restricted to sea routes, as Phoenician caravans also operated throughout Western Asia, tapping into well-established trading zones such as Mesopotamia and India." End quote. Okay, so they're just a couple of modern sources just to give you an overall sort of view and a snapshot. And now we're going to go back to the 1800s. We're going to look at a few books and journals. I've been a little bit picky. I've not just used, random books by random authors. I've tried to use more credible sources such as Encyclopedia Britannica, The Lancet, and some antiquarian journals too. So we're going to start off now with the Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 4 from 1817. So let's take a look at what they've got to say. I'm just going to zoom in because the old typewriter font can be a little bit tricky to read. Okay, quote, "The Phoenicians called this island, and some others near it, Baratanac, that is, the land or country of tin or lead, and more contractedly, Bratanac, which name, passing from the Phoenicians to the Greeks, and from these to the Romans, might have been softened into that of Britannica and Britannia. That the Phoenicians first discovered these islands, which were afterwards by the Greeks called Cassiterides, and are proven by Camden to be our Scilly Islands, appears both from Strabo and Pliny, of whom the former tells us that the Phoenicians first brought tin from the Cassiterides, which they sold to the Greeks, but kept the trade to themselves and the place private. And the latter writes that Mediocritus was the first who brought lead from the Cassiterides, where Burckhardt shows that we ought to read Melicartus, who is the Phoenician Hercules of Sanconiatho, to whom that nation ascribes their first western discoveries. But notwithstanding the care of the Phoenicians to conceal these islands, the Greeks at last discovered them, and gave them the name of Cassiterides, which in the Greek tongue signifies the same with Baratanac in the Phoenician." End quote. Okay, I'm sorry if I butchered a couple of those names there. I do apologise in advance if that is the case. Next, we're going to take a look at the Dublin University magazine, a literary and political journal, and this is from December 1861. Quote, "The earliest produce of the tin mines of Cornwall became articles of commerce with the Phoenicians, 1,000 years before the Christian era. The Phoenicians traded to this country for tin from Gades, a colony on the western coast of Spain," so I think that's Cadiz, "which was established about 1,100 years before Christ. And this Phoenician colony was the channel through which the produce of the mines for about 800 years was conveyed to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, from whence, as we learn from Pliny, it was carried as far as India. After a time, Carthage having fallen, and Gades thus deprived of the freedom of her navigation, ceasing to monopolise this lucrative trade with Britain, a route was opened for conveying the tin to the shores of the Mediterranean through Gaul by land, and thus the merchants of Gaul succeeded to the trade. It is probable that this commercial intercourse between Cornwall and the southern provinces of the Roman Empire continued for 6 or 8 centuries." End quote. This next one I've left in just because I found it interesting. It's called A Child's History of England, so that doesn't sound too clever to start with. But what's interesting is it was written by Charles Dickens in 1864. So I just found it interesting that he was writing about it as well, and that he'd written a history book. And I just wanted to see what he had to say about it, really. So let's have a look at it. Quote, "It is supposed that the Phoenicians, who were an ancient people, famous for carrying on trade, came in ships to these islands, and found that they produced tin and lead, both very useful things, as you know, and both produced to this very hour upon the sea coast. The most celebrated tin mines in Cornwall are still close to the sea. One of them, which I have seen, is so close to it that it is hollowed out underneath the ocean, and the miners say that in stormy weather, when they are at work down in that deep place, they can hear the noise of the waves thundering above their heads. So the Phoenicians, coasting about the islands, would come without much difficulty to where the tin and lead were. The Phoenicians traded with the islanders for these metals and gave the islanders some other useful things in exchange. The islanders were, at first, poor savages going almost naked, or only dressed in the rough skins of beasts, and staining their bodies, as other savages do, with coloured earths and the juices of plants. But the Phoenicians, sailing over to the opposite coasts of France and Belgium, and saying to the people there, "We have been to those white cliffs across the water, which you can see in fine weather, and from that country which is called Briton we bring this tin and lead," and this tempted some of the French and Belgians to come over also, end quote. Okay, so what's interesting about that is an ancient name for Britain was Albion, and I've seen other books reference this and say that the meaning comes from Alba, white, in reference to the White Cliffs of Dover. So it's interesting that this is mentioned here. But another thing which is a little bit contradictory to other sources is how secretive the Phoenicians were about their trade. But here it says they went to France and Belgium and just said, yeah, we got it from Britain. So that's a little bit contradictory, but I thought it was interesting that they mentioned the White Cliffs, which is apparently where Albion came from. Okay, so the next one we're looking at is the Church of England magazine, volume 68 from 1870. And I've included this one because it's got some nice information about the Bristol Channel, which is going to come into play later when we look at the archaeological evidence. So that's why I've included this one. There's also some information about a tribe of people called the Veneti, which are going to be cropping up quite a lot. So just keep them in the back of your mind for now. Let's have a look at the quote. Okay. Quote, for more than 1,000 years BC, an active trade in metals seems to have been carried on with Britain, first by the Phoenicians of Tyre and afterwards by the Carthaginians and the other Phoenician colonists who were settled on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and on the western coasts of Spain and Gaul. So what's interesting there is it says that the Phoenician colonies, there was one on the western coast of Gaul. So bear that in mind. Copper they had in abundance in the islands of Elba and Cyprus, but for tin they were compelled to go beyond the Pillars of Hercules. As Pliny says expressly that India possessed neither bronze, tin nor lead, but exchanged her precious stones and pearls for these metals. We may assume that the tin of Bania was not then known, and that as Spain did not produce much, the chief supply of this metal came from our Cornish coast. Tarshish, supposed to be Tartessus in the south of Spain, is spoken of nearly 600 years BC by the prophet Ezekiel, as being the channel through which Tyre was supplied with silver, iron, tin and lead. Considering that the Phoenician sailors were the boldest and most experienced of the mariners of old, and that they did not shrink from encountering the perils of the Land's End, is there any improbability in the supposition that as they went to Cornwall for their tin, so they would visit our Bristol Channel for their supply of lead? With respect to the stone circles and avenues at Stanton Drew, I would merely submit to your consideration whether we may not reasonably assign their origin to Phoenician influence reaching these shores through that energetic maritime people, the Veneti, who inhabited a portion of the coasts of Armorican Gaul. So Armorica is reference to Brittany. Through that energetic maritime people, the Veneti, who inhabited a portion of the coast of Armorican Gaul, who were still carrying on a brisk trade with Britain in the time of Caesar, and in whose district were the remarkable stone structures of Karnak and its neighbourhood. End quote. Next, I've just got a little short one here from the Lancet in 1883. Quote, in the volumes above referred to, M. Marins Fontaine gives an account of the great current of emigration of the Phoenicians, consequently Asiatics, who, tormented by the Greeks, took possession of the Levant, gradually scattered themselves westward and occupied the whole of the Mediterranean coasts, past the Straits of Gibraltar, and great numbers of them, steering along the western coasts of Europe, went as far as the Cassiterides Isles, and even to Great Britain. End quote. Okay, so this next one's quite a long one, but there's quite a lot of information here and references to some of the classical era writers as well, so that's why I've included this one, and it's from the Western Antiquary from April 1883 to April 1884. Again, I'm just going to zoom in because the type font's a little bit tricky. So let's have a look what they've got to say. Quote, the Phoenicians, very careful in keeping to themselves the secret of their trade in tin, which traffic, says Dr. Henry, as quoted by Sir Hawkins, was enjoyed as a profitable and exclusive trade to these islands for about 300 years. There is the well-known story told by Strabo, the celebrated Greek historian and geographer, from AD 19. He says that the captain of a Phoenician vessel returning from Britain, seeing himself pursued by a Roman galley, chose rather to run his vessel among rocks that the Roman might experience the like fate, than be the means of discovering so valuable a commerce to the enemy of his country. The captain, having escaped from the wreck, claimed from his country compensation for the loss of his vessel and cargo, and it is said he was paid from the public treasury the amount of his claims. We are informed, says Sir Hawkins, that the Phoenicians in their voyages to Britain sailed from Port Cadiz, which is another name for Gads, to the harbour of the Artabri near Cape Finisterre, from whence after 4 days' sail they arrived in Britain. Strabo, as above quoted, relates that Publius Lucius Crassus, having made many fruitless attempts to discover whence the tin was brought, at length succeeded and arrived in Britain. Diodorus Siculus, BC 44, says, those Britons who dwell near the promontory of Belerium, which is the Land's End in Cornwall, live in a very hospitable, polite manner, which is owing to the great intercourse with foreign merchants. They prepare with much dexterity the tin which their country produceth. For though this metal is very precious, yet, when it is first dug up, it is mixed with earth, from which they separate it by melting and refining. When it is refined, they cast it into ingots, in the shape of cubes or dies, and then carry it into an adjacent island, which is called Ictis. For when it is low water, the space between the island and the continent of Britain becomes dry land, and they carry great quantities of tin into it in their carts. Here the merchants buy it and transport it to the coast of Gaul, from whence they convey it overland on horses in about 30 days to the mouths of the Rhone. Okay, so that's interesting, because when we look at some archaeological evidence later, namely the Nebra sky disk, which was found in modern-day Germany, tests have shown that the tin used to make it was actually from Cornwall, so that could be indicative of these overland trade routes. From the foregoing extracts, it appears that the traffic in tin was conducted in two ways, by sea and by land. The situation of the Ictis has been much disputed and cannot be exactly known. A careful reading of the above leads many to say that Ictis was some place near Cornwall and near the Land's End. They were Britons near the Land's End. They had great intercourse with foreign merchants. These Britons, near the promontory of Belerium, carried their tin to an adjacent island which is called Ictis. It was then not far off but near to Cornwall, and the people were those of the extreme west. Mr. Whitaker says, Melcarthus, or Medacretus, brought the first Phoenician vessel to our coast about 5 centuries before Christ, but Richard of Cirencester, a very early writer, says that the Phoenicians came here 1,000 years before Christ, when the whole island was inhabited and cultivated. The story told by Strabo shows that the Phoenicians carried tin by sea. Tin they could take on board, 4 days' sail from Cape Finisterre. And as they come for tin, they found it in Damnonium, which is now Devon and Cornwall. Such was the earlier or Phoenician route, which, having been by sea, remained secret for so long a time. Caesar, here quoted by Sir Hawkins, remarks that this commercial intercourse with Britain was in his time, which is BC 58, carried on by the people who inhabited the towns of the Veneti, so here's the Veneti again, who had great advantage over us, the Romans, in their shipping. Polwell remarks that the voyages of the Phoenicians were not mere coasting voyages, and Sir Hawkins says that it was the discovery of the bright star in the shoulder of the Lesser Bear, which being the nearest to the pole, varies the least from the position of any of the stars, that probably encouraged the Phoenicians to undertake long voyages and to expose themselves to unknown seas. That the Phoenicians feared to pass the Pillars of Hercules, as your correspondent WFC asserts, is amply disproved, as may be seen in Corey's Ancient Fragments. I have placed before you the statement of authentic and ancient historians, and if we refuse such evidence we may deny any historical event. I will only repeat what was said in my last, that all the Cornish historians say that the Phoenicians did come to Cornwall by sea. Notice especially what Strabo says, the captain of a Phoenician vessel returning from Britain. What was this ship carrying from Britain, if not tin? Where was the ship likely to get it? It was to be had only 4 days' sail from Cape Finisterre. True, there was an overland trade about Caesar's time, but Strabo wrote not as of recent things, but as the historian recording long past events even in his time. End quote. Okay, so that's interesting. We've got mention of the Veneti again, and Caesar does write about them. I believe he saw them as a bit of a threat, and he eventually came with a fleet and destroyed them. I think, if memory serves me correctly there. Okay, next we've got a journal from the Journal of the Manchester Geographical Society, volumes 3 and 4, 1887. This is just a short one, but I've included this because it mentions Ireland, and as we saw in a previous video, there was a Barbary ape skull discovered in Ireland. Now, these Barbary apes were confined to North Africa, which shows certainly travel, possibly trade between the two. Who was in North Africa? Well, we know Carthage was in Tunisia. It's a possibility that that could be some evidence to support the trade route. But yep, I thought I'd include it just so, because it seems to tie things together. Quote, the Assyrians were the great rivals of the Egyptians in the eastern Mediterranean. They conquered Phoenicia in the year 886. They conquered Egypt 672 years before Christ. These conquests mark an important era in the history of the civilization of the Mediterranean. From this time forward, instead of having Egyptian manufacturers spread over the Mediterranean, we have articles of Assyrian workmanship distributed by the Phoenician merchants. We have no evidence that the Assyrians as such were a maritime people, and we find that they trusted the work of the distribution to the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians became their servants and distributed their wares far and wide over the Mediterranean area. In tracing the distribution of Assyrian art in the Mediterranean area, I would point out to you that we find it abundantly in the region of Greece. We find it up the river Dnieper in the north of the Black Sea. We find it in Italy in the Etruscan tombs. We also, and this is a very curious fact, find traces of art undistinguishable from that of the Assyrians as far west as Ireland. The article which you see on the diagram, I don't have the diagram unfortunately, which was found some years ago in a bog in Ireland, is identical in design with the diadem on the head of an Assyrian king, found by Layard at Kojunjik and now in the British Museum. Thus we have evidence of the spread of Assyrian articles somehow or other as far northwest as Ireland. In all probability, such things were distributed in the first instance by the Phoenicians, and afterwards passed from hand to hand, in the same way as articles made in England now penetrate into the heart of Africa. End quote. Okay, so that's going to conclude the first chapter. I've just given you some modern day sources to give you a general overview. We've gone back to the 1800s to look at what the sources from that period of time have to say. Some takeaway points are mention of trading outposts on the western coast of Gaul, which sounds like it could be the Brittany area. We also have a mention of the Veneti, which are a tribe of people in that inhabited Brittany, Maurica. They are described as being merchants, traders. They also have a large fleet of ships. So they do sound very similar to the Phoenicians, actually. So I'm wondering if it could have something to do with one of these trading outposts that were set up there, whether the Phoenicians who were stationed there ended up intermixing with the local inhabitants there and becoming their own sort of tribe. I don't want to say that's absolute fact. Just because the names sound the same doesn't mean we should jump to that conclusion. You know, that's not how etymology works. But it's certainly interesting. There's certainly similarities, and it's something that definitely needs to be investigated further. So we will be doing that further down the line. Next, in the next episode, we're going to look at how Cassiterides relates to tin, so we're going to have a look at some Greek language. I've got some interesting information regarding the Silures for my Welsh viewers. So for anybody who doesn't know, they were a group of people who inhabited part of mainland Wales, and there's some mention of them later, and it actually relates to their origin, and it's from Ptolemy. It's actually from Ptolemy's Geographia. So I'm sure my Welsh viewers are going to find that interesting. So stay tuned for the next part of the series where we're going to look at that. We're also going to look at the classical sources as well. So I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned, and I'm sorry it's taken a long time to piece together, but I've just struggled finding the time to record it. So I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the next one.